explain to me about the chains on the fallen man?
Here's the idea. Our nation's terrible and unique history with slavery and Jim Crow continues to disproportionately deny a majority of African Americans their fair shot at the American dream, perpetuated in large measure by white Americans who harbor either unconsciously or consciously bias against people of color. I was and am part of the problem. I was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, into a privileged world where the idea of white supremacy was rarely questioned. As a child, the only black people I ever interacted with in a meaningful way were the people who worked for us. I felt a huge amount of sadness as a kid, seeing how they and other African Americans were treated in the South. I knew something was deeply wrong, but it was not okay to talk about it. To my surprise, I discovered that my own uncomfortable journey to talk about this was connected to an untold, hidden history of our nation.
You know, it's hard to be black. The world controlled by white folks. Du Bois said we always have the double consciousness. We trying to be black, and meanwhile you got a white ghost hovering over your head that says, if you don't do this, you'll get killed. If you don't do this, you won't get no money. If you don't do this, nobody will think you're beautiful. If you don't do this, nobody will think you're smart. That's the ghost.
It was astonishing to me that many of the first Africans in the American colonies weren't slaves, but indentured servants. For a while, poor blacks and whites worked alongside each other.
The connection between Europeans and Africans was actually quite robust. A lot of marriages, formally and informally, a lot of children, formally and informally, probably much greater integration between people of African descent and European descent than we have today.
Indentured whites and blacks worked for their masters for 5 to 7 years.
The elite decided to split those groups and start creating whiteness in the colonies. And part of their charge for all the men was to be drafted into the slave patrol to manage the slaves for the elites.
This notion of divide and conquer, to keep poor whites always knowing that they were not at the bottom.
The transatlantic slave trade took off in the early 18th century and produced huge profits.
One of the reasons why the United States is such an advanced country is because of not only slavery, but the slave trade.
One of the reasons Wall Street was created in the first place was to finance the slave industry. Everything from buying slaves to even mortgaging them.
You're seeing the building of insurance companies because Africans are revolting and you need to have insurance policies. You see the construction of banking because these voyages have to be financed. And therein, you begin to see the seeds, the kernels of an advanced economic system. And the rise of capitalism is clearly on the backs of slavery and the enslaved Africans.
The frenzy for profits produced by cotton and the sale of slaves in the new states also increased the physical violence against them. This cruelty and the forced separation from their families led more slaves to try to escape.
The United States Supreme Court sanctioned a law, the Fugitive Slaves Law, that requires the country to hunt slaves no matter where they are. There's no provision for that in the Constitution.
White people, whether they owned slaves or not, clearly had a stake in making sure that the majority of blacks were maintained as slaves. The immense pressure over slavery led to the start of the American Civil War in 1861. 7 slave states had broken away from the U.S., forming the Confederacy. America's Civil War was fought for 4 horrific years. To win the war, President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing Southern slaves so they could fight for the Union. Only with the war's end were Northern slaves finally freed.
Mom and them didn't know where to go. You see, after freedom broke, they didn't know where to go.
The idea that these 4 million people were set free without any kind of reparation. They had worked, their ancestors had worked, they helped to build all of the institutions that we think about in the South and in the North before the Revolution, and they received nothing.
Pressured by abolitionists, the federal government amended the Constitution by passing the Reconstruction Amendments, which officially ended slavery and gave U.S. citizenship to ex-slaves. The amendments were supposed to protect freed slaves against future discrimination.
But the whites feared more than anything else that Reconstruction might succeed in reordering Southern society. Whites had an intense hatred for blacks who wanted to get ahead.
The Southerners wanted to control these 4 million people that had been freed, and this was something that even Northerners would come to understand and agree with in terms of controlling this inferior people as they continue to see them.
Without federal enforcement of the new civil rights legislation, the states enacted the Black Codes. These punitive laws restricted the movement of blacks, rigged the labor economy against them, and doomed them to low wages and debt. The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896 created separate but equal, the legal separation between black and white. It's always been hard for me to believe that these so-called Jim Crow laws remained in place until 1964.
Jim Crow was really born in the South, although it would go north, certainly, but in the South it would become legal. It would become part of state laws, local laws.
I think it's fair to say that Dixie, the so-called white South, has left a very deep imprint on the political culture of the United States. It was defeated militarily during the Civil War, but not defeated politically, because its white supremacist ideas were not defeated. And in fact, it seems as if the part of the reconciliation between Dixie and the rest of the country is to give Dixie a pass.
The South had lost nearly everything in the war, but we refused to surrender. Instead, we united around a strange myth known as the lost cause. I grew up surrounded by it. It was always the Yankees or the War of Northern Aggression. Monuments to Confederate battlefields and generals were everywhere. We were a separate people who were superior, distinct, and noble. But I always felt that beneath this mask of Southern gentility and outward politeness was a culture that was deeply flawed at its core. It was the Southern Klan's violence and a labor shortage after World War I that drove 1.6 million African Americans from the South to the North and Midwest. There, they worked in the steel mills, railroads, meatpacking plants, and automobile industry. But poll taxes, literacy tests, and the Klan's intimidation in the North kept blacks from voting there. The jackpot that followed the American victory in World War II, which gave birth to the American dream, good housing, education, and employment, was off limits to most African Americans. Nowhere was systemic racism more on display than in our national housing policy.
It was the government leading the way in creating a segregated landscape in every metropolitan area in this country. Throughout the country, mass production builders got bank loans guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration on condition that no homes be sold to blacks.
Redlining by banks denied mortgages to black people even in their own communities. Black people understood that when pursuing the American dream, there were two Americas, one for white people and one for African Americans. From this tension emerged the Civil Rights Movement, where blacks were unflinching and fearless.
We are determined to be free. That's right. We've gone too far to turn back. Let us be calm. We are together. We are not afraid. And we shall overcome.
These changes are coming faster than I expected. It's difficult for me. It's difficult for all Southerners.
There was an understanding that Southerners were not going to easily give up their control, their power, this idea of the inequality between the races. There was always this understanding that there was going to need to be this federal intervention on the level of a Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in this case. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 64 was very, very important because it said that if you were receiving federal monies, then you could not discriminate based on race, gender, religion.
Incredibly, the legal discrimination against African Americans that began in the 1600s only officially ended in 1964 with the enactment of the Civil Rights Act. But all across the country, not just in the South, expressions of open racism went underground. White privilege was finding a way to maintain itself. The national pushback against the civil rights movement and the laws it helped enact began right away.
How much damage has this done to communities of color? And the answer is enormous, enormous damage.
You see it in terms of the population of our prisons. You see it in healthcare outcomes, in terms of life expectancy. You know, it's criminal because, you know, people are suffering and people are dying.
They're mad. I'm mad. We should all be mad, man. We should all be angry because of what's going on right now.
So the way race plays out today, not just in the South, but the whole country, is this profound anxiety that a lot of people have, especially white people have, about growing diversity. They're quite scared because they feel like they're about to lose not simply their neighborhood, but their sense of self, who they are.
I'm not sure how it can be fixed.
Could she be right? Is there really no way out of this? One thing I know for sure is that oppression against African Americans has been relentless throughout our history. This history is not just in the past. It's still very much alive today. Leveling the playing field for African Americans is one big answer. We tried this with Reconstruction and with the Civil Rights Act, but fierce white resistance pushed back against both.
The hard nut of it is really whites. So we had it exactly backwards, right, in terms of the Negro problem. We have a white problem in the United States. But I think people won't get this on their own. That it really takes a lot of work because this is so deeply in our DNA. And it's reflected in our politics, the way we do politics, the way we do our economy, and the way we think about ourselves. But we actually need to give birth to a new white identity, a white identity that doesn't need to dominate.
But to do this, we have to recognize that we as white people have benefited enormously from our privilege at the expense of other people. The cost of this prejudice and inequality has come at far too high a price. Why are we so afraid to face the possibility that we might actually gain something with true equality? This is an American story, not just an African American story that they should bear the burden of. Let's claim this history and finally, as white Americans, let's claim this history and finally live up to our constitutional ideals of equality and justice for all. Solving racism of any kind is incredibly difficult. But if we continue to deny that a problem exists in the first place, this wound will continue to fester and divide us. I'd like to finish and leave you with this quote. When you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression.